The Midnight Man, a novella from the Kingston Chronicles by Stevie George. Copyright Stephen George Baxter 2020, 2021. All rights reserved. No part of this publication may be reproduced, stored, or transmitted in any form by any means electronic, mechanical, photocopying, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the publisher. Frosty wind clawed at my skin as I ran, bare feet striking the ground with tremendous thuds. I had been running for what seemed to be an unfathomable stretch of time as the minutes and hours blended together in my mind. Only by observing the sun could I discern what time it was. Throwing my head up, I saw that the sun hung deep in the west amid a purpling dusk sky, peppered with white flecks of light stabbing down at the surrounding countryside. I could not recall the purpose for my movement. Frantic as it was, I was forced to concentrate on my breathing, which had now become heavy with fatigue. Much like after being startled awake from a deep sleep, I needed more time for my mind to truly appreciate this waking world in which I sprinted through. While I had no recollection to call upon, there was one sensation that I had slowly become cognizant about. Deep in the center of my chest, I could feel a profound emptiness, an intense void which ached my soul and provided me a driving motivation that forced me to keep moving. My strides, however, now had become desperate and irregular. While the hollowness burned in my chest, my limbs felt a yet more fierce burning with each step I took. The flat green fields that I had traversed over soon turned into wilderness as I was confronted with a dense thicket. The surrounding branches ripped shallow valleys of red into my exposed limbs as I dashed over the shrubs and low-hanging fauna. A muscle-twisting sensation accompanied my legs as the ground took a steep incline upwards. My arms swung with greater intent, their momentum aiding my legs in the task of scaling up the hill in front of me. A few moments later, the thicket broke into a clearing as I reached the hill's crest. My body ground to a halt. I gasped the frosty air, desperate to fill my lungs. The emptiness flickered in my chest, urging me to continue my path. But the caustic stinging in my legs and the labored breathing that scattered from my thin lips signified that rest was a necessity. I leaned on a nearby birch tree, its waxy texture rough on my back. As I crouched down, I allowed time to pass, for my body to recover. The wind continued to blow, its temperature slightly colder upon this hill. The trees behind me whispered as a gale moved in between their branches. The dusk sky before me shone as the sun began to fall behind the distant hilltops, leaving behind a thick red ribbon that lassoed itself across the western sky. As my eyes trailed across this canopy of reds and purples, I felt a bittersweet sting in my heart. I marveled at the way the sun painted the sky with a multitude of fantastic colors. But the sight also filled me with a great sadness that I could not yet understand. Underneath this majestic light lay a land that also matched the sky in both beauty and melancholy. A great river stubbornly rolled its sunset-tinted water east towards the sea. It fashioned fantastic waves that crashed upon the shores, creating such a noise that a blind man would have mistook it as the sea. So wide was this river that no bridge had ever been built over its great, watery expanse. Upon its roaring banks sprang forth a green and pleasant land that stretched a great distance in every direction. Much of this land had become grazing fields for cattle and sheep, with stout stone partitions that threaded their way across the flat plains and rolling hilltops. The fields, however, retained some of their wildness, with islands of thickets and woodland areas that now casted long black shadows across the greenness that surrounded them. In between these two imposing natural wonders towered a mighty city, whose black frame splashed across the land. But unlike the surrounding natural beauty, this city had no colors to speak of. Kingston, I spat. Verbalizing the word, my tongue felt thick, coated in a greasy saliva. I knew of this place. Its dark structures stood like minuscule mountains, while its streets flowed with lights that formed shallow streams of brightness. From my resting place on the hilltop, I saw how Kingston's harbor sliced into the river with narrow black fingers, desperately holding on to great ships which bounced upon the waves. I witnessed how spindly tracks of some kind, akin to the legs of a great spider, crookedly maneuvered their way through the fields, pulling with them smoking bowls of steam. Through unprecedented development, Kingston had further pushed itself into the surrounding natural area with its enterprising tendrils. From this backdrop, I could recall small fragments of information about this man-made hive of brick and stone. The city of Kingston had always been a place focused on seafaring and modest trade amongst its neighbors. This commercial activity, however, has now clearly exploded as mighty ships and metallic carts passed through its borders. For all of these developments which bolstered Kingston's grasp on the surrounding area, there seemed to be one thing that stood out to me. As my eyes wandered across Kingston's buildings, I saw that a bright light sprang from the center of the city, fighting off the coming darkness. However, many different areas of the city still remained untouched by light. A slight pang of fear sprang in my heart, bringing questions to the forefront of my mind. How did the people of this city create such a light? Had they spread this light across such a wide area in an attempt to fight off the coming of midnight? Midnight, I whispered, chewing on the word. It left a bitter taste in my mouth, a feeling of resentment. I had a reason to be here, a purpose as to why I had run an unknowable distance and now stood gazing at this city. As my thoughts reverted inwards, the emptiness in my chest painfully throbbed like a second heart in my breast. I wished to remain for a time longer, but I could not resist the longing pull that now grasped at my senses. My legs found life again, and I began to run. Downhill, my sprint briefly turned into a slide before I hit horizontal ground. Forward I motioned, pushing towards Kingston. As the city drew closer, the wilderness of the countryside became increasingly infrequent. The empty feeling inside of me became stronger with each passing step towards Kingston. A good sign, but for why I could not remember. I needed more. I needed to understand my purpose, the reason for the emptiness in my chest. I recalled much well upon the hill. Height was always good for clarity. Should I find a vantage point somewhere within the city, I might be able to glean more into my purpose. I consulted my fragmented memory. I knew of a great church that stood near the center of Kingston, a tall, towering block of stained windows and stone. I concluded that such elevation above the city's lights may inspire my mind into reminiscence. A shallow fatigue made itself known in my lungs when I finally reached the top of the church tower. The gaps within the architecture's stone slabs and the statues that adorned its sides provided my narrow fingers enough purchase for me to clamber up with little discomfort. So tall was this church tower, however, that even someone such as I began to struggle as I neared the structure's summit. The sun had completely vanished by the time I clawed my way to the top, the sky a deep black with a desperate few stars dancing in the sky. The church lay close to the town center, in one of the areas in which Kingston had grown numerous pillars of light. Their brightness washed everything it touched in a dusty yellow color. Though surrounded by these shining new developments, this powerful structure that had been built with heavy stone and artistic stained glass stubbornly held on to its age. I remember when I first saw this building before the streetlights. It became the first structure in all of Kingston to shine every night, lit by thousands of candles within its grounds, all shadows cast out by uncountable tiny flames. But now, it seemed that the candles have been replaced by whatever mechanism lit the streets. The church still stands proudly among the dust as it had done before, but as I ascended its walls and peered through its windows, very few candles were lit, much like many of the buildings I had passed on my way here. Surveying the cityscape, I could see that many of the city's structures shone a graying yellow from their windows. These internal lights mixed with those on the street to create a blanket of dull light. While these new lights had scared away the darkness with the greatest of ease and convenience, they failed to shine as brilliantly as those many candles that had been in the church long ago. The bells of the church began to sing, their sound reverberating through the cold stone under my feet. I listened to each toll, counting aloud to myself quietly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I fell silent, but the bell rang once more. 8. I asked the church, suddenly caught off guard by the unexpected ringing of an 8th bell. Quickly, I became concerned that it may have answered with a 9th, but the bells fell silent, quietly confirming the 8th toll. I raised a cold hand to my brow and massaged it gently, its sharp coolness contrasting the heat which radiated from my skull. As I traveled in the hours past, I had time to gather my thoughts, to remember and to comprehend the circumstances in which I had found myself in. I understood that I had lost time. Never in the past had it taken such an amount of time to traverse from the countryside into the city. But as I entered its streets, I found that Kingston had become a hostile place for me. A long time ago, the night had brought a dark peace to man, a circadian pattern that he followed both day and night, which allowed me to take flight upon this land with no hesitation. This night, however, too much time had been spent climbing upon rooftops or scuttling down 10-foots, and alleyways as I sought to avoid lingering in the light. It was not the light I had an aversion to, however. Myself and others like me coveted it, almost worshipped it when we saw it shine as the moon or sun in the sky above us. For a time, many years ago, we even studied their movements in the heavens above and lived our lives in harmony with those great discs of light. No, I avoided the light as I dared not be seen by the people of Kingston. I know that, should any man lay eyes upon me and hold my image within his mind, it would spell a terrible fate for one of us. To fall under the gaze of man is to be understood. What a man sees, he considers and then places into simple frames of understanding. Such frames could be fashioned from concepts regarding safety and danger, usefulness and impracticality, the common and the spectacular. He then further expands upon his ideas, creating more categories to separate what he sees into multiple representations while using increasingly complex frames in which objects and ideas can be contained within. Through his thoughts, man can witness a single thing but understand it in 1,000 different ways. It is for this reason I must avoid the sight of man. To be understood in such a manner and forced into the multiple cognitive cages would slowly tear my soul apart and drive me to an unescapable madness. Not all men think with the same quickness, and some men avoid some thoughts altogether. But once a man starts thinking, when he truly starts thinking, he cannot stop. Once man begins to grasp us within his mind, we begin to feel his mental probing almost instantly. It often starts slowly with a feeling of hollowness, an emptiness in one's chest, but gradually swells and expands into a crazed void from which no sanity may ever return. If myself or others like me were to fall under the gaze of man, the only way to prevent our slow decline into insanity as our souls are torn apart within a man's mind is to slaughter the one who saw us. I had no memory of being seen by any man, but I now understand that it must be for this reason I had begun my flight so many hours ago. I stood at the edge of the church tower and peered west. The wind had calmed slightly, its forceful gale now gently licking my skin. I hoped that surveying the city from such a height might inspire a sense of direction within me into where the one who saw me resided. While regarding the city from my vantage point, over the lights in which the city dimly shined, darkness found its home within the more residential areas. As I regarded this canopy of black rooftops, the feeling of emptiness intensified in my chest, and a sudden, powerful sense of urgency took hold of my limbs. I could feel my body try to take flight towards this darkened area of Kingston. Unlike last time upon the hill, however, I had the cognition to resist the animalistic urges to break into full flight. I concentrated, focusing on the feeling, using it as a guiding light. On the edge of brightness, where the streetlight fades and the darkness dwells, on the far side of Kingston's center, that is where the pulling demands I go. I placed both of my hands firmly on the dry stone parapets of the church. I wished to stay here, to watch the sunrise, but my body continued to rebel against my non-action, and I was compelled to move once again. As I slipped away from the brightness of the city center, I found myself once again submerged in a refreshing darkness. The wind had picked up once more and now howled its way through the empty streets, noisily beating against my ears as it went. I carefully twisted and scampered through the streets, using the pangs of hollowness in my chest as a compass to guide me towards my destination. Closely knit dwellings, each armed with identical, tall square windows flanked me while forming a wall that protected the surrounding area from the light that shined in Kingston's center. Like the sun rising on a distant horizon, the city's light made an attempt to break over the rooftops of each house. But it lacked strength, and only residues of light spilled into the street, casting a gray twilight over all it touched. I stalked past the dwellings, skulking on hands and feet should I need to suddenly hide from the sight of any who may be out at this late hour. My eyes flickered at windows and down 10-foots, hunting for the right place. The destination was here. One of these houses. I could feel that the soul I was looking for was close. I had been gazing upon a house directly opposite to where I had crouched when my thoughts became interrupted by a short, intense pain in my chest. So sudden was this pang of emptiness that my hands clasped at my chest as I let out a quick gasp. Here, I wheezed. The pain diminished as I spoke, but my hands defensively remained at my chest. I allowed time to pass for a short while as my eyes spread across the building. A door to its left, a stout rectangular window to the right, and a second directly above. No lights shone from within the building, at least not from the 2 windows within eyesight. Enter, I asked myself. My destination was this house for certain. My flash of emptiness confirmed that. I simply had to enter this home and quietly end the man who had seen me. I had to complete my task with utmost secrecy, as should I awaken anyone in the street with the chaotic noise that killing usually inspires, I would risk being seen by a multitude of others. To have your soul comprehended by one person is a slow and maddening process. To have your soul comprehended by a multitude, however, to have a group discuss, share their ideas, refine the frames of reference in which you are understood together, that would be instant, mind-altering torture. Silent, I confirmed. I motioned towards the entrance of the building, a slim and dark door with an iron handle. I tested the handle with a gentle twist. It spat out a quiet metallic sound as it refused to turn even a small distance. I let out a deep sigh as I wrapped my fist around the door handle, covering it with thin fingers. Breathing deeply, I slowly began to twist, but the lock stubbornly held against me. I strained my arm, the veins on my wrist becoming visible under the pressure. But the handle remained stubborn, and so I brought a second hand to assist. Slowly I could feel the internal locking mechanism give way until a sudden bang dully sprang from the door, and all pressure in my hands dissipated. The wind roared its approval as I opened the door. With cautious speed, I crossed into the darkness of the house. As I entered, I could see the faint outline of a staircase in the dull lighting, and so flew towards it, bounding up groups of steps with long, silent strides. As I climbed to the last step, I saw 2 doors stationed on the landing before me, both closed and silently guarding the rooms that lay behind them. The door positioned towards the back of the house, however, captured my attention instantly, as between the door and the floor lay a gap in which a bright light skittered towards me. Excitement. This is where the soul I sought must be. The void in my chest once again manifested itself, more intense than any moment before. It suddenly racked across my whole body, bringing forth a burning sensation that I could not resist. I lost control as my limbs snaked their way towards the door, smashing it aside. A light from within the room wrapped around me with a great brightness, bringing havoc to my eyesight. The momentum from my sudden flight forced me to continue through the door, where I was confronted by a silhouette, standing firm and unmoving in the center of the room. With a tremendous fury, my arms thrusted towards the figure, my hands bludgeoning the silhouette with such force that my hands violently emerged from the other side of its torso with destructive ease. I was ready to experience a sudden feeling of relief, a warm fullness within my chest once again, but I felt no sensation, not within or without me. My hands expected the resistance of bone, my skin prepared to feel the wetness of blood. My arms readied themselves for the human's weight to collapse. None of these feelings came to pass. It was as though I had punctured a cloud, now bathed in the same glow as the figure. My eyes became familiar with the level of light in the room. In my confusion, I began examining the frame that my hands had skewered. It was a statue of some kind, equipped with the features that reminded me of the female variety of mankind. This statue, however, was unlike those that I had seen decorate the church. While the statues that clung onto the church walls were crafted from stone, this figure was shaped out of thin wire, expertly wound together to create a hollow frame. Further separating this shape from its stone counterparts was that it was draped with a soft silk of the most vibrant colors. It was only now that I truly appreciated that instead of ripping apart the soul who saw me, my arms merely punctured through a mannequin, adorned in a dress the color of sunshine with beautiful sky blue ribbons daintily hanging from its fabric. "Day," I whispered quietly, unable to restrain my appreciation for something this magnificent to my eyes. I withdrew my arms, and the hollow figure fell to the ground with a soft thud. As I regarded the dress-clad mannequin on the floor, now with 2 violent holes in its chest and stomach, I almost felt ashamed that I had caused such unnecessary damage to something so charming. I looked around the room for a moment, completely forgetting about the soul I came to find. Pressed against the wall furthest from me stood a low table peppered with materials, threads, and a lantern that shone in almost unnaturally bright light. The soul I sought must be a tailor, I thought to myself. A dressmaker. The emptiness I had felt previously had now been replaced with a great curiosity. My eyes scattered across the dressmaker's table as I walked with childlike steps towards it, spotting a white glove upon its surface. I felt compelled to pick it up and examine the dressmaker's unspoiled work. The whiteness of this little hand garment was pure like that of the stars that glitter across the night sky. What a wonderful thing to have been made. I looked at my hands, covered in filth from my clambering and skulking up buildings and across the streets outside. A long time ago my hands were soft and gentle, much like the gloves that I saw before me. Now they were monstrously deformed. The flesh from my fingertips had long ago atrophied away, leaving only sharp, jagged bone behind. The skin that was left on the palms and knuckles had become as tough as leather, much like the soles of my feet. How long had my hands taken such a form? I picked up a glove, dirt spilling from my fingers onto the star-white fabric. Gingerly, I slipped my hand inside. Quickly, the material expanded beyond what it had been designed to, and I could feel a tight squeeze constricting my palm. I pushed my hand onwards, my splintered fingertips stabbing their way through the glove's material, until the garment met the webbing in between my fingers. The glove must have been designed for a hand half the size of mine, as it barely wrapped around my hand and left my fingers exposed. I raised my hand across from my face and examined it with an almost adolescent curiosity. I clenched my hand into a tight fist before fanning out my fingers. Stars. I spoke aloud, a fraction louder than intended. Almost immediately after I spoke this word, as though I had summoned it myself, a throbbing sensation slowly expanded in my chest, an unpleasant reminder of the emptiness I felt, now steadily expanded into a slight pain. I raised my now gloved hand to my chest, the soft material warm, but ineffectual as the pain intensified. I don't know who or what you are, but I'm not looking for any trouble. A voice rattled from behind me. My eyes widened and I twisted on my heels towards the sound. Clad in a blue jacket stained in patches of black, an aged man with bone-white hair stood in the doorway, a countenance spread across his face that expressed both caution and fear. "How can you be here?" the dressmaker said firmly, his wrinkled hand clenching a long pair of scissors like a knife. I could barely hear him over the beating of my heart. I could feel his eyes roll over me, and the sensation of being watched magnified the painful thumping in my chest. I felt that with every second I stood in his sight, his mind worked frantically to understand what I was. I could bear it no longer. With desperate movements, I threw myself at the old man, flailing my shattered fingers towards his eyes. The old man, however, quickly brought up his scissor-armed hand to shelter his face from my assault. The momentum from my charge pressed the metal through my palm, forcing its sharp tip to protrude past skin and bone. Black bile streamed from my wound as I screamed, a high-pitched sound completely foreign to the soundscape of Kingston. I wailed with such angry passion that the old man cowered, covering his ears. The emptiness had now been replaced with a total, animalistic rage that now filled my chest. Removing the scissors from my hand with a painful pull, I scolded the old man with a strong kick to his knee. I felt a bone shatter as the sole of my foot made contact, and an audible crack scattered across the room. "Help!" the old man cried as he crumpled to the floor with a juddering bang that exploded across the floorboards. I swooped down to him, firmly planting my wounded hand over his eyes. Holding my free hand above the man's chest, I straightened my fingers and brought them together tightly. The old man struggled underneath my restraining hold as he meekly continued to call for help. Thrashing about on the ground, He desperately pulled at my wrist in an attempt to pry my bloodied hand off his eyes. The dressmaker's attempts at resisting my grasp were futile, as my rage had inspired a wicked strength within me that far surpassed his. Gently, at first, I pressed the tips of my fingers into the space just below his ribcage. At first the old man did not respond and continued to squirm and resist as he had before, but as I slowly increased the pressure, he began to panic. "No, no, no. Please, don't," he cried, as his hands moved from my restraining grasp to try and repel the advance of my free hand. My fingers began to break the skin. Tiny brooks of blood began to stream from underneath my fingernails. I pushed further. The old man gasped as his head snapped towards the doorway leading out of the room. "Get out," he shouted towards the darkness. "Leave." He repeated these cries as my fingers bluntly sliced into his diaphragm. I was knuckle deep when I began to truly feel the warm wetness that I had been denied earlier. When I struck at the dress-clad statue, the old man's grip intensified, his screams now replaced with the gargling of blood. I shoved my fingers further, my whole hand becoming submerged in the old man's body. I swam through organ and muscle until my hand was underneath the dressmaker's rib cage. Violently, I started to squeeze whatever I could within the old man's chest and pull. My hand worked independently, pulling out pulps of flesh and organ, dripping with sinister amounts of blackened blood. With each fistful of flesh I withdrew from his chest, I could feel the emptiness in mine receding. As death hastened towards the dressmaker, fullness settled into me once more. A steaming pile of the dressmaker's insides had piled up beside me when I realized that he had stopped resisting. His arms impotently laid by his sides, and any noises he previously sputtered from his mouth had ceased. Releasing my grasp from the dead man's head, I could now appreciate the horrified visage he wore on his face as his life ended. His eyes were shut tight, throwing wrinkles across his face while his mouth expressed a pained, blood-infused grimace. I let out a deep sigh as my arm slivered out of the dead man's chest, leaving behind a cavern that pooled into a thick poultice of red. The rage inspired by the emptiness within my chest had now receded, and I once again felt whole. A cool calmness now settled over my consciousness, and I welcomed the feeling like a cold spring on a blisteringly hot day. I returned to a standing position when a jolt of discomfort flashed in the palm of my hand, painfully reminding me of the wound that the dressmaker managed to inflict upon me. When I scrutinized my injury, I realized that not only had the old man opened a wound in the palm of my hand, but also that the hand in question wore the white glove I had picked up from the table. The pure star-white material was now infected with a black hole of blood in its center, and a regretful tear in its fabric. It was a shame that such a beautiful thing had become ruined in the melee. I was deep in thought when a noise suddenly caught my attention. A gentle patter, the sound of soft feet upon cold floorboards. My gaze threw itself towards the doorframe, peering into the darkness of the corridor. It suddenly dawned on me that throughout the altercation, myself and the old man had produced a great amount of noise between us. I had screamed when the old man stabbed me with his scissors while he cried for help as I ended his life. He also cried something else as I began ripping into his frame. In the chaos of killing, he shouted, "Get out and leave." At that time, I had thought these commands were directed at me. Only now did I realize I was not the only other being in this household. I continued to look into the darkness. Slowly maneuvering towards the staircase, I could see a small and slender figure, its eyes reflecting light back towards me. Unfortunate, I growled, feeling the emptiness once more returning to my chest.
I find it interesting now, considering all I have seen these past hours, that in all the poems I've read and all the songs I heard people sing, the only description I ever hear of someone's eyes is the color. Anthony is dead, and while I did see the thing that killed him, I cannot begin to imagine what it was. It had skulked over his broken body, a wiry mass of muscle, its hand dripping with my husband's life blood. Its appearance was impossibly unnatural, and yet, this creature had an almost human aesthetic. That is, if it was not for its abhorrent eyes. I first saw eyes like these when my husband had returned from a business venture out of town. If only I understood what those eyes heralded while I still had time. But long before this, I had concerns about Anthony. He had been acting strangely since the new year, and I, being his wife just short of 40 years, knew his habits and routines well enough to understand that things were not normal between us. At first, I took no notice of my feelings. After all, I had no reason to doubt him. He had been a loyal partner whom I had loved dearly since the day we met and throughout our 40 years of marriage. Not once did he do or say anything that made me think twice about his motives. It was one of the many reasons I loved him. He was a simple, straight-talking kind of man who had familiar work routines and repetitive social rituals. He was a rock that I could stand on. I knew that he developed these habits while working under his father, Simon Key, as a tinker in a family-owned repair shop near the center of town. While Anthony's father fixed all manner of broken knickknacks that came into the shop, Anthony took a fancy to shoe repair. His father was also a straight talker and often expressed that he never cared much for shoes and old footwear. But Anthony developed a real talent for mending tattered old work boots from a young age. Shortly after we were married, Anthony's father died of consumption, and the shop was handed down to my husband. Anthony tried to walk in his father's shoes and maintain the tinkering trade for a while, but gradually drifted towards footwear repair until his father's tinkering shop became his own cobbler shop, the Key Cobbler. Then, as always is the case, time passed on, and me and Anthony lived our lives. We were young, in love, and had the rare security of owning our own business. It seemed only fair then, that in an almost perfect life to be there would eventually be some misfortune dealt to me. After a few years of married life, I learned that I could not carry a child. 2 miscarriages over 4 years confirmed to the doctors that I in all likelihood would never give birth to a healthy baby boy or girl. While hearing this diagnosis from the doctors caused me great pain, it was the miscarriages themselves that truly crushed my spirit. To experience the heights of future motherhood to then fall into the damned despair of losing a child, it was the kind of suffering that cannot be explained to those who had not lived through a similar experience. I understood that I would never see my baby's face, watch my child run or hear it laugh. I understood that, yet, I still felt like I had lost someone most dear to me. I never planned to be just a mother. I took pride in being my husband's wife and found great value in helping around the Key Cobbler with him. It's just that I had the fortune of having lived a wonderful life filled with love up until this moment, and I wanted to share that love with the children we would bring into this world. During this dark time in my life, it felt like I carried a huge, mother-shaped stone in my arms. Yet, motherhood was not to be my life and I was to remain childless for the rest of my days with Anthony. He helped me through that difficult time by being the steady and simple man that he was. At work, Anthony would often say the devil makes work of idle hands when people asked him why he was always busy. I always thought that phrase was just a casual response to a common question. Now I understood that the devil was indeed working with my hands by forcing me into carrying this great sadness. So, I began stitching and mending clothes alongside my husband as he repaired shoes within our shop. With every threaded needle and stitch sewn, I hoped to keep the devil as far from my hands as I could. After a time, Anthony's Key Cobbler became known as our Key Cobblers and Alterations, and we quickly became a well-known business that attracted patrons from across Kingston. So popular was our little shop that I would often have to take my work home and use the spare bedroom we had as my own tailoring room. After repairing many garments, I taught myself how to fashion my own clothing and even had the fortune to sell some of these homemade dresses at the shop. We lived like this for many years, me and Anthony, but it was in January of this year, just after Anthony's birthday, when I began to notice subtle changes in my husband's behavior. He turned 57, the same age that his father died, when he began asking me strange questions. Questions such as, "Do I look old to you? And what would you do if I suddenly dropped dead?" While his age and health were common themes that he would discuss with me, it was the sudden interest in his own death that caused me concern. Soon after these questions started, another change manifested in his behavior. He insisted on taking long walks alone after work, almost every night. "It's to keep my stamina up," he would say with a wink, whenever I asked him about this odd change in routine. Anthony was always good at deflecting serious conversations with humor, but it did little to calm me. He had never shown much interest in his health before, and this made me fear that there was something wrong with my husband. Still, time passed, and his unusual habits became routine. It was not until later that year, in the spring, when I noticed a further development in his behavior that seemed to me to be more sudden and sinister than his purported interest in his health. Seemingly out of nowhere, he began to take a great interest in the post we received. He would sit at his work desk, one eye on the shoes he was mending, the other on the shop window, completely ignorant to everything else that was going on around him. Whenever he saw the postman, he would spring into motion, clumsily carrying any and all deliveries back to his work desk. He thought he was clever and that I would not notice, but from the corner of my eye I saw that he would occasionally jab a letter into the breast pocket of his dark blue jacket when he thought I wasn't looking. Initially, this caught me by surprise and immediately questions began to make themselves known in my mind. Who would be sending my husband letters and why would he be secretive about them? This was a kind of deception that was very unfamiliar to me, and with no frame of reference or previous experience to guide me, I didn't know what to do or how to confront him on his secrecy. The only thing that I knew was that I had an anxious sensation in my chest that compelled me to seek out and read one of these secret letters. At night, when Anthony was asleep, I would check his jacket to see if he had left one of the messages in his pockets, but after 2 weeks of searching, I found nothing. It was only by chance that I would eventually come across one of these dispatches. One morning, the postman came while Anthony was away purchasing some leather to keep up with his quota of shoe repairs. Much like my husband before, I jumped at the postman for the opportunity to search through this delivery. The postman had one letter to deliver, which I snatched from him, barking my thanks in his general direction. I peeled the envelope open, quickly pulling its contents out for my eyes to roll over and inspect. It was addressed solely to my husband and signed by a gentleman named Stuart Branson. I considered his name but could not recall anyone I knew with the family name of Branson. The letter was short, providing little information in the way of who this Stuart was and what relation he had to my husband. His words were warm, and he wrote in an overtly friendly manner to Anthony. Phrases like "good," "intelligent sir" were spread across each paragraph when talking about my husband, while Stuart would often refer to himself with adjectives such as humbled and grateful. Such a style of writing reminded me of how a merchant would speak to passers-by at a Sunday market. It was in between his charming words, however, that I discovered the answer to why my husband had acted so secretive over these messages. In the middle of this dispatch I read of how happy Stuart was that Anthony had decided to invest £100 in a business venture just outside of Kingston. It mentioned something of a mine, an investment in natural resources, and a meeting that would take place in the near future, among other things that I could not understand without more contextual information. The letter ended with an insistence that my husband would have to deliver the requested amount of money soon, otherwise he would miss out on an investment that would change his life forever. After I finished reading, I simply stood and stared blankly at its words while in my head I wrestled with the idea that my husband had actively hid this information from me. I couldn't decide what outraged me more, his deception in being so secretive or his stupidity in entertaining the idea of giving away such a large sum of money to a man who was perhaps trying to swindle him in some unknown fashion. I was still gazing at the letter when Anthony returned, calling out a cheery greeting as he entered. When he saw me standing letter in hand, however, a nervous expression spread across his old face. "How goes it, my lover?" Anthony cautiously asked, a stupid half-smile on his face. "How goes it?" I retorted, brandishing the letter in his direction. "Anthony Key, let me ask. How goes you? What's this I read about you and this here Stuart? Care to explain?" I was angry. It was the only emotion I was capable of at that moment, and just hearing how casual his words were threatened to throw me into an uncharacteristic rage. Instinctively, Anthony raised his hands in a defensive posture. "I didn't mean for you to read any of my letters from Stuart," he said. "You didn't mean for me to read any of these letters. Well, I have now, and now I see why you've been buzzing around like a blue-arsed fly every time you get even a whiff of the postman." I looked at the letter again, reminding myself of what inspired my rage. This Stuart, a man who I've never met or heard of. Am I reading this right? You have agreed to give him 100 bloody pounds. No bloody wonder why you don't want me to see this. Look, he said, lowering his hands, taking a slow step towards me. It's just talk for now, nothing's confirmed. I am 57 years old, you know. He laughed as he spoke, trying to disarm the situation. And I am sorry to say, Abigail, you're not much younger. I crumpled the letter into a paper ball and threw it angrily at him. This isn't funny, Anthony. You think some quips about our age and a stupid laugh is going to keep my calm. Not this time. Slowly, his hands still raised, he stepped again towards me. Listen, we got a wonderful shop that makes enough money to keep us fed and warm, but only when both of us work our fingers to the bone. God forbid, what would happen to you should I slip of me mortal coil? You bloody fool, you don't even have 100 pounds to spend. I knew what he was doing, keeping calm, changing the argument to where he could paint himself as the rational one in this situation. In my mind I knew that my emotional outburst would not necessarily help things, but his deception, his slyness, I was determined to stay angry at him. A long time ago, when we got married, I promised you that I would look after you no matter what, sickness and health. Well, since then, I've put a little money away each month to keep you comfortable should anything ever happen to me. Oh, we're talking about promises made on our wedding day. What about how a husband and wife should not be keeping secrets like these from each other? He now stood close enough to reach out for my hand, but I slapped it away. Now his expression changed, the half-smile on his round, bearded chin dissolving into a stern face. Look, right, just listen here for a second. I promise you that there's no madman's logic behind all of this. Just give me a chance to explain. His voice now took on a more diplomatic tone. I looked at him as his stout frame shuffled over to the floor where the letter had landed after I threw it at him. He took his time, slowly unfolding the paper before studying it intensely. Well, it seems we've got it all to come then. He muffled to the letter. Well, I spat the word at him. You asked for a chance to explain yourself, so go ahead. He looked me in the eye, a long drawn-out stare before he began. I've made it this far in life with my health intact. I have worked hard and avoided all manner of earthly pleasures so that I could put some money away every now and then, hoping that if I should ever die you would have enough money to live in comfort. And even though I have not spent a single penny of it, it's still not enough to keep you safe should I kick the bucket today. Now, I happened to meet a chap by the name of Stuart a while back when he came in to get a sole repair on one of his shoes. He rose the letter up in the air slightly to illustrate his words. It was only a quick fix, so he stayed in the shop and we chatted for a while. I asked him if he were a local and he said he came from Liverpool. He told me about how he was looking to spend a bit of money on some land in the countryside because he had a tip from one of his mates that there was some kind of coal deposit sitting just under the ground. I was only half listening, concentrating on the gentleman's shoes. I did not think anything of it when he left, but a while later he wrote me a letter, which I thought rather odd since I do not usually receive post from customers. But he wrote to me and told me of how he found something that would change the area around Kingston forever. Anthony put the letter in his pocket and started slowly walking towards me again. This time, however, I did not notice his slow advance. I was fixated on the origins of his communication with Stuart. He knew that since I was a local businessman, I might have some mates that would want to invest in getting his operation up and running. And well, I had a think and thought that maybe this could solve my money problem. I could turn this £100 into much more and guarantee you a comfy life should I ever die suddenly like my dad did. His words hit me. It all made sense now. He did not hide these letters from me because he was being deceitful. He was doing it because of his pride. This all started soon after your birthday. The changes in your behavior, I mean. I said softer than before, you're worried you'll die soon like your father. I didn't want to say anything. Didn't want to worry you. He stretched out his hand for a second time. I looked at it for a short while, feeling my anger fast slipping away. I love you, Anthony, but this was a very stupid thing to do, I said, grasping his hand tightly. I read the letter and I'm worried this man is going to take advantage of you. Why would you consider putting so much money into something and someone you know so little about? I reckon he's onto something. I've had a think, you know. Kingston's mainly known for fishing, isn't it? We get our coal from mines all around other parts of the country, but it costs more due to transport. What if there was a coal mine near Kingston? Cut out transport cost, all coal sales in this city would come from Stuart's mine. I'd be able to turn that small pile of money I've scratched together into a huge pile in no time at all. I looked into his eyes now, blue lights flickering above a warm, wrinkling face. He was old. Every feature across his face showed signs of age. But at that moment, his eyes looked as young as they ever did. And what if your thinking is wrong? What if Stuart sells you up the river? I asked. Well, you needn't worry about it. Turning his face from mine, he looked out the shop window, as if something caught his eye. We have been talking for a few months now. He's renting an inn near the land I've told you about. Soon he'll invite me and a group of other investors to show us the mine, and then afterwards, we're going to stay the night at the inn and hash out an agreement. He placed a hand on my face, a warm palm cupping my cheek. If I don't like the look of things, I'll bail on the whole idea. I helped Anthony button up his jacket before he left yesterday afternoon. He always hated me fussing over his appearance, but I could not stop myself. Over the years I had lost count of the amount of times that man had left the house with a button undone or his collar sticking up. While I knew nothing of investments or meetings, I did understand the importance of first impressions. I gave him a kiss as he left to get a coach from the center of town, a quick one on the cheek, a kiss that says, "See you soon, come back home safe." As he walked away, I was completely unaware that it would be the last time I would see my Anthony as a complete man. He said that he should return to the shop in the late morning of the following day, just before noon, and let me know how his meeting went. As I sat with eyes peering through the shop windows, the hours came and went, but my husband did not return. I was worried. I knew that in all likelihood he was probably just late, but I could not stop anxiety from shaping my thoughts. The countryside is a sight safer than the streets of Kingston for sure, but it was not impossible that he could have ran into some trouble during his travels. I closed the shop slightly earlier than normal, around 3 o'clock, hoping that maybe Anthony just forgot about coming to see me at the shop and instead headed straight home to rest. He said it himself, he's 57 now. Even a day's worth of travel must be tiring to an old man who has lived a very stationary life. I hurried home, worry motivating my every step. I charged through the door to our house, and when I saw my husband standing in the kitchen, my heart beating rapidly with relief. "Anthony," I cheered. I was bloody worried about where you had got to. He stood with his back to me, totally silent, totally still. I waited a short while, but Anthony did not respond to my words. He just stood there by the counter, as if I had not said a thing. I noticed he still wore the dark blue jacket and beige trousers he had on when he left me last night, but their appearance had been altered. He looked as though he had used his clothes to wipe down a chimney. "Anthony," I croaked, moving towards him. As I stepped in front of him, I placed a hand on his shoulder. Glancing about him, I saw that his complexion had become pale, his face expressionless, and in his black-stained hands he held a bottle of beer with an unsteady grip. It looked like he had not drunk even half of that bottle by the time I had arrived. "Anthony," I said cautiously, "how did your hands get so filthy?" He did not respond. "Is everything okay?" I said, reaching out to touch his hand. I almost recoiled from him as my hands met his. Unnatural coldness radiated from his fingertips. "My God, Anthony, your hands, you feel like you'll catch your death with a cold." I took the bottle from his grip and checked the temperature on his head. In stark contrast to his hands, his forehead felt like it was catching fire. A high temperature and coldness. He must have caught a fever during his travels. I took his arm and led him to the living room, guiding him into a sitting position on the settee. I swaddled his hands in a blanket that I had been drying on a clothes horse nearby the night before. "My love, please say something." Anthony's body crumpled as he hunched forward, bringing his hands to his face. His shoulders shuddered as he began to weep loudly. "It's wrong, it's all wrong." He choked into his hands. I had no idea. I knelt in front of him, caressing his arms like a mother trying to calm a crying child. "What's all wrong? Anthony, I don't understand what could have happened that would make you act like this." I placed a hand under his chin and slowly turned his neck upwards. When his teary eyes met mine, however, I almost screamed. "Your eyes," I shrieked out loud. How did I not notice this before? His irises had completely vanished. Normally, his eyes shone a cool blue, eclipsed by a black disc, but now I saw they had been replaced with two graying blue orbs set in heavy eye sockets. Seeing something that had become such a regular and familiar sight for me change in such a dramatic way brought a terrifying discomfort to me. My hands jumped to his face. "Anthony, your eyes. Can you see?" I almost shouted. "I can't not see. I can't stop seeing. I want to but I can't," he replied, moisture framing his unnatural eyes. "Anthony, you're scaring me." "What do you mean?" I can't. Anthony tried to speak further, but he burst into long and loud sobs. I could not believe what I had seen. I could not fathom what could have happened to Anthony to make his eyes so ghastly. Thinking him gravely ill, I rushed him upstairs into bed, where he quickly crashed into an exhausted slumber. I considered fetching a doctor, but the closest clinic we could afford to visit was a long distance away, and I dare not stray too far from Anthony's side until I knew what ailed him. No, instead, I decided to hasten myself towards the local pharmacy in the hope that they may be able to diagnose him from my description of him. I rushed out of my home to a pharmacy just around the corner. Like a mad woman, I recalled what I had seen to a young pharmacist behind an ill-kept shop counter. The young man's face reflected the confusion that must have been in his mind, but he remained calm considering the crazed things I had uttered to him. After listening to my explanation and asking me to repeat parts of my story, the young pharmacist explained that my husband must have caught a sudden illness from traveling because of his age and unfamiliarity with travel. Such a major change in his routine must have been more than he could bear at his age. He suggested some eye drops for my husband to apply once a day, while further mentioning that he should get as much sleep as possible until he is fully recovered. A sudden sense of relief twinkled in my chest. I almost cried at the idea that there was nothing seriously wrong with Anthony. Thanking the young man gratefully for his advice, I purchased the eye medicine he suggested and hurried to leave. But just before leaving the pharmacy, I stopped, suddenly realizing that I had not told the young man everything. I neglected to mention the mad things my husband had said to me. "I can't not see. I can't stop seeing." I could not bear the thought of repeating what my husband had said. Since Anthony had said these words, I struggled to keep them out of my mind, almost as if his words infected my thoughts. I left the pharmacy not saying a word. When I returned to my husband, I found him still sleeping in our bed. While he laid with a troubled look on his face, I thought not to wake him. He clearly needed his rest, and I would give him his medicine after he awoke. I sat watching him for a while, but after a time I found my mind wandering. Wild theories and speculations kept creeping into my mind as I tried to understand what could have happened to my husband since I kissed him goodbye yesterday afternoon. But at this time, there was nothing more that could be done. I retired to my tailor room to help keep my mind off what my husband had said. Since Anthony said he couldn't not see, I now couldn't not think. It was now evening, and the winter sunlight had begun to wane against the coming night. I entered my tailor room and searched for the lantern I kept on my work table. I struck a match and gently twisted the valve as I brought the naked flame to the lantern's burner. A brilliant light spread across the room, warmly spreading across all it touched with a buttery glow. In the center of the room stood a tall wire mannequin, draped with a dress that shone a vibrant yellow against the lantern's light. I appraised the work I had done so far and felt satisfied with the progress I had made. I had worked on this dress for just 1 week with the little spare time I had, and I surprised myself with how much I had done. The dresses I made in this room differed greatly from those that I mended in the shop. The dresses at work were designed to fit the desires of those who wanted them. They would tell me their desires and I would read in between the lines, only expressing myself in a most minimal fashion. But the dresses I crafted here were always a labor of love that I fashioned to suit my own tastes. I had decided long ago that they were only to be seen by my eyes and the eyes of my husband. In the past, I often found that when creating something you intended to be seen by others, their potential reactions often colored the choices you made. You were forced to see your creation through the eyes of others. The color yellow, for example, was never a favored color among the women of Kingston because stains from dirt and grime were more prominent on a garment with such a bright color. But I resisted this mindset. It was from the sky that I found my inspiration, and yellow fabric always reminded me of the sun. I had all but finished the dress, with only a few minor alterations left to do. I felt that I needed a task more substantial than this, however, to pull my mind away from Anthony's crazed words. There were a small selection of accessories I could fashion to complement the dress, and while I had plans to make a bonnet and a fan, this night I chose to work on a pair of white gloves. I worked long into the night, and only when I heard the distant chime of 8 bells from the Trinity Church did I suddenly realize how dark it had become. I looked around the room, admiring how the lantern fought off the darkness with a brilliant shine when I suddenly remembered Anthony. Losing myself in my work and not hearing him stir in his sleep, I had not checked on his well-being for some hours now. I hurried into the bedroom next door only to be greeted by the sight of my husband sat up in bed, staring wide-eyed into nothing. His eyes reflected a desperate gray light that came from outside, still terrifyingly void of the familiar black disc so universal but often unnoticed in people's eyes. "How you feeling now? Rested?" I asked. A few slow, quiet seconds passed. "I can feel something, like something is watching me, and I can't rest me head until this feeling goes," he said, his eyes still staring in front of him as I crouched by his side. His words worried me, but I was glad he seemed calmer than before. "Anthony, I have some medicine. I got it from the pharmacy just after I brought you to bed. It should help with your eyes, but I'm worried." I clasped his hand, hoping it would encourage him to look at me. He continued to stare across the room. "You're acting strange and I don't understand. I don't think any amount of eye medicine is going to clear up what's going on in your head. What happened while you were away?" He squeezed my fingers gently. Out of comfort or fear, I could not tell. At least by this gesture I could tell he was listening. "I also do not understand. I can't put my experience into words. I need more time to think and separate in my mind what was real and what was fantasy." He breathes. "I see that your hands and clothes are stained black. From coal maybe. What happened at the mine?" "There will be no mine. Whatever business Stuart wished to create now lays dead, along with all those who entered the mine with him last night." Anthony's words baffled me. "Dead? What do you mean?" He drew a large breath and opened his lips to answer my question when a loud bang sounded out from downstairs. My husband's neck sharply twisted towards me, his wide eyes locking onto mine. "Get down," Anthony hissed, suddenly moving into action. He almost fell on top of me as he sprang out of bed. In alarm I tried to speak, but he shushed me with a short angry finger pressed against my mouth. "You have to be quiet," he whispered, his eyes now fixated on the door to the bedroom. I had closed the door when I entered the bedroom. I closed all doors upon entering and leaving a room as a habit formed over years of trying to keep heat locked away in rooms. Behind the door, I could hear soft but rapid thuds accompanied by the sharp creak of our staircase. It sounded like someone was sneaking up the stairs with great speed. "Anthony, I think we are being burgled," I whispered forcefully at my husband, who still had his finger pressed to my lips. "No," he said, his eyes not straying away from the doorframe. From behind the bedroom door came a great crash from the tailor room, followed by the sound of thrashing, as if a great melee was taking place. "Listen closely, Abigail, what I want you to do is simple." His tormented eyes now returned to mine, his hand moving from my lips to my cheek. "I know what has come into our house and I am going to try and talk to it." I could feel his hand begin to shake against my face. "I need you to do something for me. Once I have its attention, I want you to run outside. I want you to run as far away as you can, as fast as you can. No matter what is happening, you know what it is." "What do you mean?" "And whatever you do, do not look in my direction as you leave. Just run," he said. "I don't Abigail," he whispered in a panic. "I don't have time to explain. Just do as I say." Before I had time to respond, he had already gotten back on his feet. Opening the door quietly, he left the room towards the it that had entered our house. I was motionless, in a near state of panic as I laid on the floor. A few moments had passed, yet I remained stunned and bewildered by what Anthony had said, by what he was doing. "I know what it is. Run as far away as you can, as fast as you can," he said, and then he left the room to confront whoever had entered our house. I got to my feet when I heard his voice in the next room. His words were difficult to hear, but I recognized his voice, and the grim, panicked manner in which he spoke. Suddenly I heard the sound of a struggle, gasps and groans followed by a most harrowing screech, like the sound of metal grinding on metal. It shot straight through my mind and rattled in my chest with a painful clarity. I could not resist clasping my hands tightly to my ears until the sound receded. What was that? I stuttered to myself. It was certainly not the sound of any burglar that I knew. I had no idea what was going on, but I had to see what was happening with my husband. As I moved towards the door, I heard my husband call out, "Help, help." I heard him cough. Anthony was in danger, and for a short while, this fact made me forget the danger I was in. With this desperate sense of urgency, I dashed out through the doorframe and stood on the landing, my feet bathed in the light that still shone from my dress room. As I glanced ahead, just a short distance away was the face of my husband pressed against the floor, a monstrous, atrophied hand eclipsing his eyes. He sounded like he was begging, "No, no, no, please don't," he cried out to the hand that oppressed him. He let out a painful gasp as blood began to trickle from his mouth. I tried to call out, I tried to shout, but words failed to form in my mouth. My husband's head snapped towards me, as if he could hear my silent cries. "Get out, leave," he coughed, each syllable punctuated with flecks of blood being catapulted from his mouth. My mind split, my body juddered. Half my body responded to my husband's request and tried to run for the stairs. The second half could not understand what was going on. This miscommunication between my arms and legs caused me to fall on the ground with a painful thud towards the staircase. I tried to get up. For what felt like the longest time, I tried to stand. As I stumbled back onto my feet, however, I saw that my husband was no longer struggling against a great hand. Anthony's body lay pale and blood-soaked on the ground. A great cavern had been opened in the space between his stomach and chest, and a mound of red pulp had been strewn across his legs in a smattering of blood and gristle. Above his broken body stood the thing that had murdered my husband. That was no burglar or thief that had crept into our house, but a monster. Its hulking frame, wrapped in skin that was a patchwork of white, gray and black. Its limbs, almost skeletal in width but clad together with wiry muscles. The thing had been staring at something in its hand. What had grabbed its interest I could not tell. The pure panic and delirium that sprang from seeing my husband's shattered and broken body had clouded my senses and ability to reason. Slowly, the creature turned its head, the muscles in its neck clearly defined by the shadows that the lantern cast on its frame. The thing looked directly at me, its eyes, pure black, void of any color. A word slipped from its thin lips. "Unfortunate."
A desperate shout skittered from the far end of the tunnel. The noise bounced violently off the narrow walls and low-hanging ceiling that surrounded us before fluttering away into the darkness. Huddled by a section of overburden that had collected by the side of the tunnel, I cringed under the oppressive nature of the wail as my mind unwittingly produced crude images of the violence that such a noise implied. By my side was Eric, one of 4 gentlemen who I had met only hours before. With a shaky hand, he held a Davy lamp that cast a faint light across our contorted faces. "We should snuff that lamp out. It'll see us," I whispered to Eric, "and be stuck in the dark with that thing. How will we find our way out if not with a light?" Eric snapped back in a hushed voice. I could hear the panic in Eric's voice even though he tried to mask it with faux anger. The lamp to him was a comfort that he clung to like a child who holds onto a soft toy at night. "The tracks, Eric," I retorted, pointing to our feet. "Where do you think these go? Follow them and they will take us back to the entrance." I knew little of how a coal mine was structured, but I remembered that for much of our tour with Stuart, we had walked with a cart's track beneath our feet. Surely, even if we were hidden in a previously unexplored part of the mine, these tracks would eventually lead us back above ground, or further into the mine, he said, peering up and down the tunnel. I never had chanced to ask Eric's age before we entered the mine, but seeing his heavy blonde hair hung from his head and his face only showing the beginnings of lines around his eyes, I guessed he was around half my age. I'm not saying it's a great choice, but a half and half chance is better than wandering like a bloody lost horse down here. Another scream rattled through the mine, a deeper voice than the last. That must be. Oh shit, what was his name? Eric whispered. I thought to myself, but could not remember the man's name either. but I did recognize the voice. There were 5 of us all in all when we all came down, myself, Eric, Stuart, and 2 other gentlemen whose names escaped all recollection. We met in the late afternoon at a tavern local to the mine for a formal discussion about the investment opportunities that Stuart had to offer. After a lengthy conversation, Stuart led us away from our meeting place to go on a short tour of his newly procured property. He hoped that by showing us the mine itself, it would help further illustrate its money-making potential. Initially, I was concerned as I could recall that in Stuart's letters to me, he made many references to how the mine had fallen into a state of disrepair. When I raised this issue with him, however, he confidently assured myself and the others in our party that he had recently hired a small workforce whom he employed to repair any damage to the buttresses and pillars that kept the mine's tunnels from collapsing. With this reassurance, we were in good spirits as we followed Stuart underground. Even though I was clearly the oldest of our group, I felt a childish sense of adventure, as though we were a group of young boys exploring some sort of countryside cave. With Stuart taking lead, we navigated through a series of twisting paths that became increasingly narrow as we pushed our way into the depths. As we walked, Stuart artistically spun a tale of how the money we invested would be used to create streamlined paths, modern cart tracks, and a whole manner of other additions that would, in his words, make this mine the black jewel of the Northeast. We had been exploring these tunnels for what seemed like an hour when we came into a tunnel so narrow we all had to walk single file with barely any room to stretch our arms. I was at the rear of the group with Eric walking in front of me. I felt sorry for him as we walked because he was the tallest in our group and had to stay in a permanent semi-crouched stance to avoid rattling his head against the jagged ceiling above. I was about to inquire how his back felt when suddenly I heard Stuart's voice from the front call us to stop. The others in our group mumbled. So far, we had only stopped walking so that Stuart could show us some interesting section of his mine. But here, there was nothing but narrow blackness. Stuart, have we stopped to stare blankly at these walls? A gentleman from near the front of the group asked in good humor. Another laughed with a deep chortle in response, making a sarcastic comment about how much he loved spending time idly standing in some old mine shaft. It was not Stuart who replied to these comments, however, but the voice that did silenced everyone in the group. Echoing some distance in front of the group, a pained, metallic voice gasped the word extinguish. The voice sucked out all the warm humor within our group, replacing our playfulness with a nervous hush that coated the tunnel. Who is there? Come out and show yourself. Stuart's voice barked from the front of the group. This is private property, don't you know? I saw a light dance on the roof ahead of me, accompanied by the slow thud of footsteps. It sounded as though Stuart began to advance towards the source of the metallic voice. Out with you, sir. We don't want any TR. Extinguish. Light. The voice called out again, this time with an intensity that brought a great discomfort to my ears. As I instinctively brought my hands up closer to my ears, I saw Eric take half a step backwards in apprehension. You don't get to tell me what to do, sir. Not when you're hiding on my property. Stuart's words sounded small compared to the metallic voice that came before him. I will not ask a. His sentence was cut short by an ungodly screech that rattled my ribcage. It was like the sound of 2 iron pillars smashing into each other, accompanied by the shocked voices and startled gasps of the men in the front of the group. Instantly, I saw the men in front of me turn to retreat from the commotion. Fear inspired me to follow suit as the group fled from that horrendous sound. We all cried out in panic, some voices asking in confusion what was that, other voices demanding run and get out of my way. It was Stuart's voice that I remember most clearly, above the noise that we made as we ran from the noise. I could hear Stuart, but he asked no questions, nor did he make any demands. The confidence he had shown in talking to the metallic voice had dissipated. The sun had reached high above me by the time I shuffled myself to an unfamiliar country road. The light from above played havoc with my eyes, and even when I brought my hands to my brow, I could still barely see 10 yards ahead of me. I felt as though I had not bathed for an uncomfortable amount of time as soil, Dirt and coal all clung to my skin, and my clothes felt damp from sweat. I knew that I had been stumbling around throughout the night, but for how long I had moved in the darkness before collapsing, I couldn't quite say. When I eventually regained my consciousness in the sunlight, I found myself exhausted. When I tried to stand, my legs could barely support my body. As I walked down the country road, I tried to collect my mind and come to an understanding about what my next course of action should be. Regardless of how much I strained my mind, however, I could not control my thoughts. Horrid images of the night before sloshed thickly in my brain, and I could not bring myself to think of anything else. My feet dragged along, and for some time I walked in an almost dreamlike state towards an unknown destination. It wasn't until I heard the distant sound of hooves pounding the floor that I awoke from my stupor. I turned and saw a mass of black and brown slowly approaching me. As I strained my eyes, the shape of a horse pulling some sort of wagon began to appear in the distance. It was not until I noticed the rider on the horse that full consciousness returned to me. Another man, I thought to myself. A man that I could talk to and ask for help. "Please," I called out as the coach drew close. "I need help." My voice was dry and throaty. I could barely speak above a whisper. The driver pulled heavily on the reins, bringing his horse to a reluctant stop. As the sunlight blurred my vision, I could not recognize any feature on the man's face. But I could see he was tall, even though he was sat down. His shape loomed over me, and I could feel his eyes burrow into mine. "You look like shit," the driver observed. "Been out drinking and lost your way home, eh?" I ignored his jab. I needed to tell him what had happened. I needed to tell him of the horrors I had witnessed, to get help for any who may still be alive. I tried to reply, yet my mind became entangled by the words I needed to say, and my tongue remained motionless. Don't. I paused, my lips rebelling against my intention speech. "They are all gone, huh? I knew it. Called it when I saw you from way up this road here." His laugh cut through my eardrums, compelling a hand to one of my ears with a painful grimace. "I've been in your situation before, mate. Why come from? Kingston." I could feel saliva pooling in the corner of my mouth. "Kingston, you must have drunk a lot to have got yourself lost out all this way." He looked away for a moment, his blurred face staring off into the distance. In my mind, I frantically tried to find a word, any word that would help express the grim situation in which I found myself. "Well, it's why lucky day, mate. I'm off to Ghoul, so Kingston's on me way. Cram self into me wagon, and I'll give you a lift," he said, turning to pat the open-topped wagon that his horse had pulled along the road. "A lift home," I thought to myself. If I was going to tell of the madness that I had endured in Stuart's mine, I couldn't do it without rest. Spitting a thank you in the driver's direction, I stumbled to the rear of the wagon and painfully pulled myself into the back. After several minutes of whispered debate, we came to a compromise. Eric agreed to follow the tracks, providing he could keep the lamp lit. It was silent. The light from the lamp barely touched the sides of the corridor, while the roof still hung low above us. The walls here stood further apart than in the other tunnels we had walked through. With the additional space available, we naturally crept forward side by side for a time. Instinctively, I wanted to walk behind Eric. Shameful as it was, I knew the reason for my survival earlier was because I had been standing at the back of the group with the most distance between myself and whatever had spoken in the darkness. I wanted that safety again and considered falling behind Eric should I need him to be a buffer between myself and whatever it was that attacked Stuart. But I thought it was important that we walk side by side while the opportunity presented itself. I was afraid, but as I looked at Eric, I could see that he was only a few steps away from total panic. I hoped that by seeing a friendly face, Eric could hold on to his courage until we found a way out of the mine. "We have to hurry. I don't like this quiet," Eric said to me, his eyes locked forward, his pace increasing in speed slightly. Keep it steady. Last thing we need is one of us falling over," I replied. "You wouldn't be so calm if you saw what I saw. That thing, what it did, what it looked like." He snapped back. I took a moment to think. I wanted to try and move the topic away from what had happened to Stuart. Talking about it brought visible stress to Eric's face, but even though I was afraid, there was a curiosity that welled inside of me. "So, what did the thing look like?" I asked. He had already explained what it did. How it fell upon Stuart like an animal and ripped out the contents of his stomach with the ease of a man pulling apart a cooked turkey at Christmas. "I don't know." He paused. "I think I don't know. I was near the back like you, and it was rather dark, but it looked much like a person." An angry metallic bellow rang through the corridor, reminiscent of the shrill noise that engulfed us when Stuart had refused to follow the thing's demands. I turned to look behind us but saw nothing in the atrimental void. While I had noticed the noise, Eric continued to speak unabated, as though he did not hear a thing. In the flicker of Stuart's lamp, I saw that it had no clothes, and was remarkably thin. Not even the starving urchins I see on the streets are as thin as that monster. "So, you're saying the thing is a person? Some sort of starving man who lives in these mines?" I asked. "I'm not saying that. Not exactly. I'm saying that it almost looked like a person if they had not eaten for a long time." He answered. "I heard it say something though. Something about extinguishing the light." I pressed. "If it can talk, then it has to be human, right?" "Well, I was thinking about that. But Stuart was a pretty big chap, why no? Almost as tall as me. That creature, however, seemed as though it weighed nothing at all. Like it was made of smoke. Something like that could not be able to take down a man like Stuart with such ease." I began to picture the thing in my mind. Human-esque in shape, an emaciated frame, but with enough strength to take down a large man like Stuart. "So maybe something feral. An animal who lives down here just protecting its home," I suggested. "If it was an animal, then how did it speak?" He paused briefly before letting out a frustrated sigh. "We're talking in circles now." We both fell silent at Eric's rebuttal. While words did not pass our lips, I could feel our brains working with each other, straining themselves to explain what had happened. Unable to think of a reasonable explanation, my mind wandered from the topic at hand. My thoughts turned to Eric. I felt an admiration towards the young man, even though I had not known him long. While the man looked a couple of seconds away from breaking down, Eric showed an intelligence that allowed him to think creatively with a clarity that I simply could not match. What I'm concerned about is that while we all ran from the creature, I could still hear Stuart call for help and beg for mercy. He said, breaking the silence. He was caught off guard. We all ran. Who would not act like that when suddenly faced with death? I replied, "That's not what I'm trying to get at." Stuart was closest to it, must have got a good look at it before it cut his belly open. Why would you try and beg to an animal? Call for help, I get that, but you would only beg for mercy if whatever is attacking you would understand. That was something that had been made clear to us by the screams and shouts of the other gentlemen that we heard echo through the mine earlier. By their desperate cries, it seemed the thing did not care to show them mercy either. I was about to say something to Eric when another bestial call suddenly shattered around us. The sound felt closer than the last. "Don't tell me that thing is coming for us now," Eric said, twisting his neck backwards at the sound. "What else could it be? I liked your idea before, Eric. Let us pick up the pace, eh?" I said, trying not to break into a panicked run. My senses had failed to improve by the time I woke in the back of the wagon. The driver woke me with a violent shake, but as I returned to the waking world, I failed to understand the words he spoke. I tried to listen, but his speech sounded as though his mouth was submerged in water, and while he was only a few feet away, my eyes hurt too much to read his lips. I felt dizzy and would have fallen out of the wagon had not the driver helped me out before pulling away. Now that I was awake and standing precariously on my feet, it slowly dawned on me that my sense of taste and smell had yet to fail me. Breathing in, the smell of fish flooded my nose and danced on my tongue. The driver must have dropped me off near the fish market. Over the past year or so, I had become familiar with the markets near the center of Kingston. I would walk amongst them for an hour or so in the evening and listen to the sound of traders and sellers packing up their stalls before returning home. Earlier this year, back in January when my birthday came and went, I couldn't stop thinking about how my father had passed away at the age I am now, and I would often come to the market to help clear my mind. Never in my life had I ever been concerned with my mortality. Never even had a second thought about what would happen after I died. While my father also did not care much for what would happen after he died, he did ensure that he would leave me with the shop. That shop, with the help of my wife, provided me all the security I enjoyed throughout my life after he died. I never genuinely appreciated what he had done for me until I myself turned 57. A sudden realization had gripped me, and I understood that should I die the same age as my father, I would leave my Abigail alone with the shop. She could run the shop, maybe even hire some help to do it. But money was tight at the best of times, even when we worked hard. She was getting too old to work with such intensity. My father passed on to me something that secured my future, not prolong an inevitable decline. I just wanted that for my dear Abigail. Throughout all those walks along the dockyards, I never thought that my efforts to provide security for my wife would in fact almost do the exact opposite. Now, as I stumbled through the streets, making my way back home, my thoughts were occupied only by what I saw in the darkness. "Oh God, stop it!" Eric hissed at me as I tried to pull him up from the floor. "We don't have time," I angrily retorted. "If we don't leave now, then it might be the end for both of us." As we continued to follow the track through the dark corridors of the mine, we eventually found our way back to an area that struck us as familiar. We had spotted a stout pile of wood and some mining tools stood propped up against one of the walls when Eric called out to me, expressing that he recognized the tunnel. He recalled that Stuart complained about how some of his workers must have left their equipment lying around instead of taking them to a storage area near the entrance of the mine. A bright flash of relief sparked from Eric's face as we both remembered that we first saw this place only 10 or 15 minutes after entering the mine. We were close to the exit. The metallic booms and demonic shuffles that we had heard earlier, however, had only grew with intensity and frequency with every minute that passed as we pressed on towards the surface. In a mixture of excitement and fear, Eric began to make a run for the exit. I shouted for him to slow down, but he refused to hear me. Soon after he began to run, he caught his foot on the track we had spent so long following. I watched as he painfully crashed to the floor, clutching his right leg after he landed. I tried to help him stand, but neither he nor myself were strong enough to bring him to an upright position. Damn it, I think I've broken my ankle." Eric panicked, still regaining his breath from the pain. "It's nothing, Eric. You've probably just twisted it. Now, do not panic on me. We are so close to the exit," I said encouragingly. He tried to stand, independently this time, but fell painfully back on the track, letting out a howl of pain. This was a problem. He was a big lad, and I could not carry him. Nor was there enough room in these tunnels for me to stand by his side to support him as he walked. Oh God, what am I going to do? I cannot go on. It's going to catch up with me, and it's going to kill me like it did Stuart. He swore as he shuffled to prop his back up against the wall. I was about to speak when I was interrupted by a demonic roar that forced my hands around my ears. I could feel it shake the ground at my feet, and in the corner of my eye I could see that Eric struggled with one hand covering an ear while the other remained stubbornly over his wounded ankle. When the maddening sound eventually subsided, it was replaced by the sound of Eric weeping like a babe. It had finally become too much for him. The creativity and logic that helped his mind push through this madness now worked against him, as I could see he was already experiencing death at the hands of the thing in his own imagination. "I don't want to die here," he whimpered. He was beyond the state of reason, but I felt compelled to say something. "I promise you won't." I hoped. I had returned home. Stumbling into the kitchen, my hands reached for the cupboards around my feet. I could not remember the last time I had a drink, and this sudden realization affirmed how my throat had become clogged from the dust and coal I had breathed in the night before. In the kitchen, I was hidden away from the direct light of the sun. The strain on my eyes became less intense, and in the shade my house provided, I could finally see with a certain level of fuzzy clarity. My hands explored the inside of one of the cupboards, snaking over a dark brown bottle and pulling it out into the open. as I tugged off the top and pressed the opening against my lips. A warm, bread-like flavor spread across my tongue and moistened the back of my throat. For a brief second, I lived purely for that moment, my mind given a chance at respite. I closed my eyes, and all was quiet in my home. The taste of a warm beer was the only thing that my mind concentrated on. I did not want to open my eyes. I wanted to stand here and forget everything that had happened. I do not recall how long I stood there. It could have been 5 minutes or 5 hours. But time crashed into me once more when I heard a distorted cough explode from the front door. This sudden noise painfully dragged me away from my solitude. The noise that rattled from the front door was soon accompanied by the muffled sound of footsteps. I wanted to turn and face whoever or whatever approached me, but after the brief moments of calm I had enjoyed away from all the horror that I had seen, I didn't have the stomach to confront anything. A hand lay gently on my shoulder. A soft, comforting warmth spread across my skin. The hand squeezed my shoulder gently, encouraging me to crack open my eyes. My heart warmed slightly as I saw my wife, Abigail, standing by my side. She fluttered around me, speaking muted words that I could not hear. Abigail looked worried, however, and she pressed her hand against my forehead much like a concerned mother would a sickly child. For the first time since I heard the baleful voice of the thing in Stuart's mind, I felt a warmth, the kind of warmth you can only feel when in the tender care of a loved one. My mouth opened, ready to speak. I tried to put into words what had happened, but as I looked into Abigail's eyes, my lips tightened. The sudden warmth replaced with a cruel coldness that stunned my chest. Her eyes were a solid black, like strange lumps of coal framed by the lines and wrinkles that I had become so familiar with. They were the exact impossible shade of black that manifested in the mind. Under Abigail's scrutiny, I suddenly felt as though I was back in the darkness with Eric, in sight of that deathly monster. Fear welled up inside my chest as confusion took control of my mind. Was this Abigail in front of me? Was this the creature in some sort of sick disguise? Or had I simply gone mad and I had yet to realize it? She continued to talk to me, but I still could not comprehend her words. I wanted to recoil in terror from her, but I was frozen into inaction. She took my arm and guided my stiff body to the settee in the living room where I fell heavily on the furniture, its softness taking my weight. My wife continued to speak, and I continued to not understand. The image of the thing was all I could think of now, and I could not tear it away from my thoughts. The fear progressed, welling inside my conscience until tears forced me to weep bitterly. It's wrong. It's all wrong. I bawled into a cloth that Abigail had brought to me. I had no idea. I tried to say more, but my tongue could barely craft a word between the tears that crawled from my eyes. Abigail knelt by my side and rested a hand under my chin, gently raising my face to meet hers. I was once again staring into her shadowy eyes. In the past, she normally looked at me with a calm loveliness, but as she gazed at me now, her face contorted into a painful expression. Her ghoulish vision widened beyond what I thought natural until her black eyes began to bulge out of her sockets. "Your eyes, Tan, you see," she said in a clangorous tone. "I can't not see, I can't stop seeing." I gasped. Her voice rang with a tinny quality that reminded me of how the thing had spoken to Eric in his final moments. As I looked into her black eyes, I felt as though I was face to face with that hellish creature from the mine. There was a tension in the air that made us feel increasingly claustrophobic in the darkness. I stood hunched away from the light, a mere 10 yards away from where Eric sat up against the tunnel wall. In his hands he desperately clung the Davy lamp close to his chest, its light casting long serpentine shadows around him. In the darkness, we heard a distant clatter. The noise rattled uncomfortably past us, and Eric grimaced in response. "You still there, Anthony?" Eric whimpered quietly in my direction. "Yeah, I'm still here," I replied in as warm a tone as I could, given the circumstances. He exhaled a long and nervous breath in reply. I could not blame him for his apprehension, as that was the 4th sound we had heard in the past 10 minutes, and each time the noise appeared to be getting closer. I held onto a short pickaxe that I had recovered from the pile of wood and tools we passed earlier. Due to its small size, I could grasp it with one hand, but as the minutes painfully dragged on, The metal implement that clung to the end of the handle brought a heavy discomfort to the muscles in my exhausted arms. Eric sat against the wall, unable to outrun the thing that was coming for us even if he could crawl away. Fear tempted me to make my own escape. I yearned for the open sky that I knew was only a short distance away. With every horrific sound that echoed throughout the tunnels and with the mental image that I had built of the thing in my mind, I struggled to keep my sanity. It was Eric's fear and desperate situation, however, that kept me with him. I had only met him a few hours prior to entering the mine, but in experiencing such a horrific situation with him, I felt as though we had known each other for a long time. I could not leave him now. In my mind, I rehearsed the actions I intended to make. I previously explained to Eric that he had to simply sit with the lamp and wait for the thing to come at him while I crouched in ambush a short distance away in the darkness. It was my hope that before the creature laid into him, I would take the pickaxe that I held in my hand and drive it into the creature's skull. Realistically, I knew this would not work. If this creature dispatched Stuart as easily as Eric said it did, then what chance did I have against it? I was an old man and could not rely on brute strength. I placed all my hope in the idea that the creature was more animal than man and that it would not sense me in the darkness. An eternity passed while the air around us slowly thickened and the atmosphere intensified with silence. My hand was moist with sweat as I held onto the pickaxe. Somewhere in the black void before us, the sound of silence slowly transformed into a labored breathing. Long, windy inhales followed by a gravelly exhale. I knew he could not see me hiding in the dark, but Eric looked in my direction one last time. Extinguish, a hollow metal voice called out from the darkness. Eric's neck snapped towards the sound, a wet gasp escaping his lips. Who are you? Why are you doing this? Eric asked, a feeling of panic evident in his words. Extinguish. Your light. A voice rasped, its words matching its slow inhalation and exhalation. Eric's hand fumbled with the lamp, but he did not lower its light. He instead thrusted it in front of him, no doubt hoping the light would keep the thing at bay. I raised the tool in my hand above my head, readying myself to move. I don't want to be in the dark. Please, leave me alone. Eric weakly answered the voice in the darkness. To his surprise, Eric's answer was met by a long and dreadful silence. For a moment I allowed myself to consider that the thing had somehow been warded off with Eric's light. More time passed and still nothing but stillness. I was about to cautiously speak to Eric when suddenly I saw a small object dash from out of the darkness towards where Eric was sat. I heard a loud bang as the light from the lamp flickered wildly. My eyes jumped to Eric as I saw him shudder and gasp in pain, the lamp still firm in his hands. He looked to his chest, and from it, I could see that he picked up a small black object. It looked like one of the stones that littered the sides of the tracks. I did not understand what this meant until I heard a second bang. This time the light from the lamp dwindled significantly. Previously the light shone far enough to touch the wall opposite where Eric had propped himself up, but now the light had barely the strength to light up the immediate area around Eric. It was only until the third bang sounded out that I realized what the thing intended to do. If Eric would not lower his light, the thing would take it from him at a distance. The light dimmed once more, barely a glimmer left. The Sunday to set brilliantly in a clear blue sky. Its warmth licked at my skin and its light wrapped around me. I found myself floating slowly towards its center yet. I was not concerned. My thoughts were only of the calming heat. As I approached closer, the sun split itself into two balls of light that sailed from each other. Each moved with a relaxed slowness until they were at equidistant positions with me in the center. I closed my eyes and stretched out my fingers. I wanted to feel every inch of my body revel in the warmth that flowed from these magnificent lights. It was not until the warmth began to die down that I opened my eyes again. Without warning, a gust began to encircle my body, sucking away the warmth that had been previously gifted to me by the light. The blue skies had been smudged with a dark purple, and the light from the twin suns had become eclipsed by spheres as black as charcoal. The black suns undulated as though they were crafted from a sickening jelly, and as the winds continued to blow, I could only feel a dull icy pain puncture my body. My eyes became hypnotized by the gelatinous masses that hung before me. There was something in them that I found familiar, something about them that I had seen before. It was only then did I realize that these black masses in front of me were no longer suns. I awoke in darkness. I instantly felt great discomfort in the surrounding black. The lack of color and light made me feel as though I was under the baleful gaze of dark eyes somewhere in the obscure shadows. I found myself flat on my back, the softness of blankets wrapped around my body. I could remember fragments of the fevered exchange I had with Abigail. During my delirium, she must have ushered me upstairs so that I could rest my fractured mind. But now that I had awoken, absent of all light, I felt compelled to open the curtains. As I got up and pulled the curtains apart, the gray light of distant street lamps flooded into the room, spreading throughout the darkness with the suggestion of space and form. I glanced around the room. The outline of a large bed commanded the center, while a series of wardrobes and dressers ghostly stood by its flank. As my eyes fluttered between the furnishings, I was glad to see the fog that had distorted my vision had now all but dissipated. I returned to the bed, pulling its warm blanket back over my body. I felt tired and wished to return to sleep, but as I lied down and closed my eyes, I felt a dreadful weight fall across my mind. I tried to ignore the feeling and was determined to continue with my rest. But the longer my eyes were closed, the more oppressive the darkness became. I felt the walls of my bedroom narrowing and the clothes I wore tightening. Within the darkness, it felt as though in my self-inflicted blindness, the world around me twisted itself into that dreadful coal mine. I could bear it no longer. I sat up and trained my eyes on a wardrobe that stood by the opposite side of the room. Its wooden color had been tinted gray with the faint light from outside. But I needed to see something, anything that was not covered in black. "How you feeling now?" "Rested." I heard a soft voice speak. I recognized the tone in the darkness. It was Abigail. I had never been more grateful to hear her voice. Her words almost shone with a light of their own. I considered my response. "I can feel something. Like something is watching me, and I can't rest my head until this feeling goes." I finally said, my throat feeling dry. "Anthony, I have some medicine. I got it from the pharmacy just after I brought you to bed. It should help with your eyes, but I'm worried." I felt a warm hand wrap around mine. I was about to turn to look at her, but suddenly remembered the last time I looked into her eyes. I remember how her eyes were as dark as the night I had awoken to. "You're acting strange and I don't understand. I do not think any amount of eye medicine is going to clear up what is going on in your head. What happened while you were away?" To hear such care in her voice, to be sat in such a warm and comfortable place. It was all such a contrast from what I had experienced the night prior, and it brought doubt into my mind. It was as though my current safety put my past danger into question. "I also do not understand. I cannot put my experience into words. I need more time to think and separate in my mind what was real and what was fantasy." I whispered, "I see that your hands and clothes are stained black. From coal, maybe. What happened at the mine?" I looked down, glancing at my hands. She was right. My hands were filthy with coal. I saw how the blanket I had slept in had now was also stained with patches of black. There will be no mine. Whatever business Stuart wished to create, it now lays dead, along with all those who entered the mine with him last night. I could feel her hand tighten. "Dead? What do you mean?" I thought to myself. What else could it mean? Everyone who had entered the mine had died. A sharp scream bounced around me, forcing my hands to clasp tightly around my ears. Even with the protection of my palms, the sound assaulted my senses, and I stood helplessly in pain. It was not the thing that had screeched, however. It was Eric. As the light from the lamp had almost been extinguished from the barrage of stones that came from the darkness, one stone must have dislodged the oil container of the lamp, which rapidly spread a bright flame across Eric's chest. He had flung the battered lantern away from him and began beating his torso furiously, as he shrieked in panic. I stood in total shock. My mind reeled from this golden horror as a sickly burning smell filled the tunnel. When planning this ambush, I understood that in all likelihood these events would play out in such a way that neither myself nor Eric would survive. But as I watched the flames attack the air around Eric's panicking frame, I could not imagine what would happen next. "Save me!" I heard him scream as he began to roll clumsily across the floor. With the narrowness of the tunnel, coupled with the debris and tracks that carpeted the ground restricting his movements, the flames continued to eat away at his chest. His words were desperate and forced my mind to only think of helping Eric. I strode forward to him. "Hold on," I shouted with a shaking voice. The flames had grown to knee-height as Eric writhed in pain. A bright light covered the tunnel, bathing it in a light that I had become unaccustomed to. As the fire grew, I spotted a figure standing on the far side of the tunnel. I was just 1 yard away from Eric when my eyes caught it. Hunched on the edge of the frantic dancing light's influence stood a deathly shape, watching the chaos it had brought. It indeed looked much like how Eric described it. A famished human which was impractically thin. The creature's skin was a patchwork of white, black, and gray, while its limbs were long and brittle, as though they could not support its body weight. Yet, as it stood with spider-like stillness, its impossible body did seem to be exactly that. Impossible. What brought the greatest fear in me, however, was its terrifying countenance. Its eyes were like that of a fly, huge in proportion to the rest of its face, but consisted only of pure black. They looked as though they were larger than a man's hand and still. Even with the fire raging from Eric's chest, I could see they were darker than the blackness that loomed from behind where it stood. The thing looked as though it was patiently observing Eric, who meekly faltered on the floor as the fire continued to sear his clothing and into his flesh. But as I had stepped into the light and caught sight of the creature, it too cast its vision over me. Instinctively, I raised my mining tool, brandishing it in a threatening manner. Filled with fear from seeing this impossible creature, I tried to appear imposing and dangerous, even though it must have seen the terror in my face. The creature twisted unnaturally, bringing both of its hands to its chest, its long fingers wrapping around its thin torso. "No, no, 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 no," the thing began to repeat, each no sounding like a hammer smashing a pane of glass. For a brief moment, I thought I had somehow caused it to panic and stepped gingerly closer to Eric. "Leave us be, thing. Go back to whatever hell you come from," I shouted in defiance, waving my pickaxe menacingly towards the thing. "Fool," it bellowed, its eyes narrowing into spindly slits on its face. In an explosion of movement, it began to run forwards, using all 4 of its limbs to cover the distance between us with blistering speed. My hands jumped in front of me defensively, surprised by the sudden change in the thing's behavior. The creature leaped forward, using its thread-like fingers to painfully wrap around my wrists. I could feel the coldness of its touch through my shirt sleeves as it pulled me sharply towards it. I tried to resist its pull, but its strength was irresistible, and I stumbled forward, dropping the mining tool to the ground below me. I began kicking and screaming at the creature, struggling in any manner that my body allowed in an attempt to free myself from the thing's clutches. While the creature itself was slightly shorter than I, it used its long, emaciated limbs to force my arms above my head. I continued to struggle as I felt my feet lift from the ground. It lifted me sharply, and I felt the backs of my hands painfully crack against the tunnel's jagged ceiling. From this uncomfortable height I looked down, seeing the creature's skeletal frame in a backdrop of the fire that continued to rage from Eric. He must have been on fire for at least 30 seconds now. Yet the fire that had sprang from the lamp oil showed no signs of faltering. He was no longer screaming in pain, but panting desperately as he struggled to remove his jacket and shirt. The creature had lost all interest in watching him, however, and instead looked intently at me, a large portion of its unnatural eyes covered in leathery white skin as it continued to glare at me. While I could not say for definite where the creature's gaze rested, I felt as though it stared straight into my eyes. Even as I struggled against this creature's grasp and felt the barbed rock from above me cut into the backs of my hands, I could not help but return its gaze. I felt its grip tighten around my wrists. Shame! A low whistle rattled from its thin mouth. It released one of my wrists from its grasp, which forced me to suddenly swing painfully in the air slightly as my full body weight pulled on a constrained arm. The creature brought its arm backwards, like a cutpurse readying to stab a victim in the chest. I knew what the creature intended and could not help but close my eyes in anticipation of its deadly assault. I expected to be torn apart much like how Stuart had been. Instead, I heard a familiar metallic screech as the cold pressure around my restricted wrist dissipated. Free from the creature's grasp, I fell awkwardly on the ground, the sudden shock forcing my eyes open. I saw that it had been Eric's actions that had inspired the creature to cry out and release me from its grasp. Eric had finally removed the clothing that had caught ablaze from the lamp's oil, and flung the garments a short distance away from where he had struggled. As I sat up, I saw how he clasped onto the creature's leg, clawing and biting away at the limb as though the fire that almost consumed him had burned away any fear that remained in him. His frantic assault must have hurt the creature, or at least surprised it as it flinched slightly with each bite and thud that came from Eric. The light from the oil-stained clothing had begun to die down, yet, even with the darkness strengthening, Eric's sudden surge of violence inspired me to respond in kind. In the corner of my eyes, I saw the hand pickaxe quietly lay by my side. With a speed unfamiliar to me, I returned to my feet and reached out for the mining tool, its wooden handle rough in the palm of my hand. Holding it in both hands, I looked towards the creature. In response to Eric, it was now bent slightly over his huddled body and used its branch-like arms to jab at his exposed torso. A sickening thud followed every blow, and Eric's aggression quickly began to decrease in intensity. My body, acting almost independently, jumped forward. With a desperate cry, I brought down the pickaxe with as much force as my exhausted arms would allow. The creature did not notice my approach until it was too late. The tip of the mining tool smoothly pierced one of the thing's bulbous eyes, causing it to explode in a shower of gelatinous black ink. It howled in response, smashing a fist once more into Eric before bringing its hands to its wounded eye. Eric finally fell away from the creature, allowing it to turn its back towards me. I still wielded my pickaxe in my hand, and I attempted to follow up with another vicious swing. Before I could strike it once more, however, the creature began to stumble away from me. It let out a second howl of pain before skittering away into the darkness, its thin limbs propelling it with an inhuman speed. I watched it fade into the darkness, my chest heaving from fatigue. The noise from the creature's movements faded into the depths of the tunnels until the only sound was my heavy breathing. Eric's clothes continued to burn a short distance away, but the light was a mere fraction of what it had been at its peak. I could just barely see Eric as he lay on the ground, sprawled in an uncomfortable position. "Eric," I dryly called out to him. "Are you okay?" No response. I fell to his side and pulled him towards me until his back laid flat on the uneven ground. When my eyes caught sight of him, my relief turned into despair. The last strike from the creature must have struck him hard in his face, as all I could see in the fading light was a ruptured crater that mulched his features into a soup of bone and blood. I knew he was dead, but I still asked if he was okay. I repeatedly asked him, and each time I expected a response. I shook his shoulders. I called his name. Despair brought an unbearable chaos to my mind, and I could no longer control my actions. I remained by his side until the light that came from his burning clothes finally faded and I fell to total darkness. You have been listening to The Midnight Man, a novella from the Kingston Chronicles by Stevie George. Please check out the links below if you would like to purchase the full book. Feel free to comment, like, and share this video. It would be greatly appreciated.